In 1941, the world was holding its breath, suffocating under the weight of a war that seemed to have no end. The Nazi machine, a relentless force of steel and fire, had carved its way across Europe, leaving a trail of broken nations and shattered lives. The swastika, a symbol of terror, flew over Paris, Warsaw, and Oslo. From the coast of France, the German army stared across the narrow English Channel, confident that Great Britain, the last bastion of defiance, would soon fall. The nights in Britain were dark, not just because of the mandatory blackouts that plunged cities into an inky blackness, but because of a deep, gnawing fear. The constant threat of invasion was a shadow that loomed over every home, every street, and every heart. The Blitz had rained fire upon London, Coventry, and other cities, and the drone of Luftwaffe bombers was a constant, terrifying lullaby. Hope, it seemed, was a currency in short supply. Yet, in the midst of this darkness, a different kind of war was being forged. It was a war to be fought not on the grand battlefields with thundering tanks and screaming artillery, but in the silent alleys, the shadowed corners of occupied cities, and deep behind enemy lines. This was the War of the Shadows, the domain of a new, secret organization known as the Special Operations Executive, or SOE. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's mandate for the SOE was simple, yet audacious: set Europe ablaze. To fight this secret war, the SOE needed secret weapons. They needed tools that were not just effective, but invisible. Weapons that could be smuggled, concealed, and used without a sound. And so, in the quiet workshops of a place known only as Station 9, a team of brilliant, unconventional minds began to work on a project that would become one of the best-kept secrets of the war. The result of their efforts was a weapon so strange, so unassuming, that it defied every notion of what a gun should be. It had no familiar shape, no recognizable features of a pistol. It was, for all intents and purposes, a simple metal tube, about a foot long, with a small, knurled knob at one end and a trigger that looked almost like an afterthought. When the magazine, which also served as the grip, was removed, the weapon looked less like a tool of war and more like a bicycle pump or a piece of plumbing. It was this strange, almost comical appearance that would earn it a host of nicknames, and it was this harmless look that would become its greatest asset. When this new weapon was first shown to the British commandos who were being trained for the most dangerous missions imaginable, their reactions were a mixture of confusion and disbelief. These were hard men, soldiers who were used to the solid, reassuring weight of a Webley revolver or a Sten gun. They looked at the strange, pipe-like object in their hands and couldn't help but smirk. It felt flimsy, unbalanced. It looked, for lack of a better word, like a toy. How could this strange contraption possibly be a lifesaver in a life-or-death struggle against a battle-hardened Nazi soldier? The initial impressions from the other side were even more dismissive. The first time a captured example of this weapon found its way into the hands of German intelligence officers, it was met with derision. They, who were accustomed to the fine engineering of the Luger and the Walther P-38, saw this British pistol as a pathetic, almost laughable attempt at a covert weapon. It seemed a product of desperation, a sign that the British were running out of ideas and resources. They catalogued it, photographed it, and filed it away as a curiosity, a footnote in the grand arsenal of war. They could not have been more wrong. They had no idea that this toy would soon become the source of a creeping, silent terror that would haunt their sentries, patrols, and officers in the dead of night. They had no idea that this was not a toy at all, but a ghost in the making. The gun was called the Welrod, and its story was about to be written in the silent deaths of its enemies. Part 2: The First Encounter. Imagine a cold, damp night in occupied France. The air is thick with the smell of wet earth and distant wood smoke. A gentle mist clings to the ground, muffling all sound and turning the familiar landscape into a ghostly maze. In a small, requisitioned chateau serving as a regional Gestapo headquarters, a German Hauptsturmführer, a captain in the SS, is finishing his paperwork. He is a man of routine and order, a man who believes in the absolute power and invincibility of the Reich. The war, for him, is a distant, glorious symphony of German victory. Here, in this quiet corner of France, he is the law. His office is on the ground floor, its large windows offering a view of the gravel driveway and the main gate, which is manned by 2 sentries. The captain feels secure, protected by the might of the German army. He takes a sip of his brandy, the warmth spreading through his chest, and allows himself a moment of satisfaction. The local resistance has been quiet, and he believes his iron-fisted policies have crushed their spirit. Outside, in the darkness beyond the reach of the weak lamplight, two figures move with the silence of ghosts. They are British commandos, dropped behind enemy lines just days before. Their mission is simple, but incredibly dangerous: eliminate the Gestapo captain, a man responsible for the torture and execution of dozens of resistance fighters. They carry with them the usual tools of their trade: knives, explosives, and their standard-issue sidearms. But tonight, they are also carrying something new. They are carrying the well rod. As they approach the chateau, the two commandos split up. One takes a position overlooking the gate, his eyes fixed on the two sentries who are stamping their feet to ward off the cold, their rifles slung over their shoulders. The other commando, a young lieutenant, circles around to the side of the building, moving towards the captain's office window. He holds the well rod in his hand. It feels cold and unfamiliar, a far cry from the comforting grip of his service revolver. He has practiced with it, of course, on a remote training range in the Scottish Highlands, but this is the first time it will be used in anger. He can't shake the feeling that he is about to face a man armed with a Mauser, while he is holding a piece of plumbing. The sentries at the gate are bored. They talk in low murmurs, their voices barely carrying in the damp air. Suddenly, one of them stiffens. He hears a sound, a soft phut, like a champagne cork being opened at a distance. He turns to his companion, a question on his lips, but the word dies in his throat. His companion is slumping to the ground, a small, dark hole appearing in the side of his head. Before the first sentry can even process what has happened, before he can raise his rifle or shout a warning, he hears the same soft phut again. Then, a sharp, stinging sensation in his chest. He looks down, confused, at the spreading stain on his tunic. His legs buckle, and the world dissolves into darkness. The entire encounter has taken less than 5 seconds, and the only sounds were two soft pops that were easily mistaken for a distant car backfiring or a branch snapping in the woods. Meanwhile, the lieutenant is at the captain's window. He peers through a small gap in the curtains. He can see the German officer, his back partially turned, his face illuminated by the desk lamp. The captain is relaxed, unsuspecting. The lieutenant knows he has only one chance. He raises the well rod, his heart pounding in his chest. He pushes the muzzle of the gun against the cold glass of the window pane. This was part of the training. The rubber baffles at the end of the suppressor would muffle the sound of the breaking glass and the gunshot into one, single, contained noise. He takes a deep breath and pulls the trigger. Inside the office, the Hauptsturmführer hears a faint, muffled crack. It sounds like a log shifting in the fireplace. He turns, slightly annoyed by the interruption. He sees the spider web of cracks in the windowpane, but his mind doesn't have time to register the danger. A fraction of a second later, a searing pain rips through his neck. He gasps, a gurgling sound escaping his lips. He clutches at his throat, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and disbelief. He stumbles backward, his hand knocking the brandy glass off the desk. It shatters on the floor, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden, deadly silence of the room. He collapses onto the expensive Persian rug, the life draining out of him. His last sight is of the shattered window, and the dark, empty night beyond. He never saw his attacker. He never heard the gunshot. For him, death had come out of nowhere, a silent, invisible hand that had simply reached out and extinguished his life. Upstairs, another German officer, hearing the sound of the breaking glass, calls out the captain's name. There is no answer. Cautiously, he makes his way downstairs. He opens the office door and freezes. The captain is on the floor in a pool of blood. The window is broken. But there is no one there. No sign of a struggle. No sound of footsteps. It is as if the angel of death itself had paid a visit. The officer's blood runs cold. This was not a normal attack. This was something else. Something new, and something terrifying. The legend of the silent gun had just begun. Part 3: Why it looked like a toy. To truly understand the fear that the well rod inspired, you must first understand why it was so consistently, and so dangerously, underestimated. In a world of over-engineered, mass-produced weapons of war, the well rod was an anomaly. It was a masterpiece of minimalist design, stripped of everything that was not absolutely essential for its grim purpose. Its appearance was not just unconventional, it was deceptive. It was a predator disguised as a harmless piece of metal. Let's start with its size and weight. The most common version of the well rod, the Mark II, was just over 12 inches long, or 31 centimeters. It weighed around 34 ounces, or just under 1 kilogram. This made it small and light enough to be easily concealed. An agent could tuck it into the waistband of their trousers, slide it into a long coat pocket, or hide it within a rolled-up newspaper. To a generation of soldiers used to heavy, bulky firearms, the well rod felt insubstantial, almost fragile. It lacked the reassuring heft that a soldier associated with a reliable weapon. Then there was its shape. A conventional pistol has a distinct silhouette, a grip, a trigger guard, a slide, a barrel. The well rod had none of these in the traditional sense. Its main body was a simple, uniform cylinder, no thicker than a man's wrist. At the front of this cylinder was the suppressor, or silencer, which was an integral part of the weapon. At the back was a large, knurled knob. This was not a hammer, but the breech, which had to be manually twisted and pulled back to eject a spent cartridge and load a new one, much like a bolt-action rifle. This manual operation was one of the keys to its silence, as it eliminated the loud, metallic clatter of an automatically ejecting shell. The trigger was a simple, curved piece of metal housed in a small, rudimentary guard. But the most unusual feature was the grip. On a normal pistol, the grip is a fixed part of the frame. On the well rod, the grip was the magazine itself. This small, detachable box held 6 to 8 rounds of .32 ACP or 9 mm ammunition. When the magazine was removed, the well rod transformed from a pistol into a simple, anonymous metal tube. This was a brilliant piece of design for concealment. A captured agent could plausibly claim that the tube was a tool, a part of a machine, or, most commonly, a bicycle pump. The magazine could be hidden separately, and without it, the well rod was just an inert, and seemingly harmless, object. The materials used in its construction also contributed to its unassuming appearance. It was made of simple, blued steel, often with a dull, non-reflective finish. The grip panels on the magazine were made of hard rubber or plastic. There were no polished wooden grips, no intricate engravings, no signs of the fine craftsmanship that German officers, in particular, appreciated in their own sidearms. The well rod looked cheap, functional, and disposable. It looked like something that had been cobbled together in a shed, not a precision instrument of assassination. Because of its top-secret nature, very few people knew about the well rod's existence. Even within the British military, it was a closely guarded secret, known only to the SOE and the commando units that used it. This secrecy bred rumors. Among the few soldiers who caught a glimpse of it without being read into the program, stories began to circulate about a strange, silent pipe gun. They heard whispers of agents being issued with what looked like a tool for plumbing, only to be told it was one of the deadliest weapons in the British arsenal. These rumors, combined with the weapon's bizarre appearance, created a mythos around the well rod even before it became widely known to the enemy. It was the bicycle pump gun, the silent death pipe, the plumber's nightmare. For the British commandos who learned to trust it, these nicknames were a term of endearment, a nod to the weapon's deceptive genius. For the Germans who would soon encounter it, the strange, toy-like appearance of the well rod would become a symbol of a new and terrifying kind of warfare. It taught them a hard lesson, that in the shadows of occupied Europe, the most dangerous things often come in the most harmless-looking packages. The gun that looked like it couldn't hurt a fly was, in reality, a whisper of death, waiting for its moment to strike. Part 4: The Terrifying Surprise. The initial German assessment of the well rod was a fatal miscalculation. The officers who had dismissed it as a crude, desperate toy were about to learn a terrifying lesson in the psychology of fear. The true horror of the well rod was not in its power, but in its subtlety. It was a weapon that didn't just kill, it unnerved, it demoralized, and it sowed the seeds of panic. The surprise was not the bang, but the lack of one. The primary reason for the terror that the well rod inspired was its incredible silence. It was, without a doubt, one of the quietest firearms ever made. A conventional pistol, even one fitted with a suppressor, still produces a significant noise. There is the supersonic crack of the bullet, and the loud, metallic sound of the slide cycling back and forth to eject the spent casing and load a new round. The Welrod was different. It fired a subsonic bullet, meaning the projectile traveled slower than the speed of sound, eliminating the sharp crack. More importantly, it was a manually operated, bolt-action weapon. The user had to physically twist and pull the breech to load the next round. This meant there was no automatic cycling, no clanging metal. The only sound was a soft, dull thud, a noise so quiet that it could be easily mistaken for something else. At a distance of just a few feet, it was often completely inaudible amidst the normal background sounds of a city or a windy night. Imagine being a German soldier on sentry duty. You are standing in the cold, your mind wandering, when your companion, just a few feet away, suddenly crumples to the ground. You heard nothing. You saw no muzzle flash. One moment he was there, a living, breathing man, and the next he is a lifeless heap on the cobblestones. You rush over to him, and you see the small, neat hole in his temple. Your blood runs cold. Who did this? Where did it come from? The attacker could be anywhere, in a doorway, on a rooftop, right behind you. The silence is the terrifying part. It's a silence that screams of an unseen, unheard predator in your midst. The second element of the Welrod's terrifying nature was its close-range lethality. It was not a long-range weapon. Its effective range was considered to be about 25 yards in daylight, and much less at night. But it was never intended for a firefight. It was a tool for assassination, designed to be used at point-blank range. The front of the suppressor was slightly concave and made of hard rubber. This was a deliberate design feature. An operative could press the muzzle of the Welrod directly against their target, a guard's back, a windowpane, a sleeping officer's head. This direct contact would further muffle the already quiet sound, containing the entire event in a single, almost silent moment. It turned the act of killing into something as quiet and intimate as a tap on the shoulder. The victim would often be dead before they even registered the touch of the weapon against their skin. Third, despite its crude appearance, the Welrod was surprisingly accurate at the close ranges it was designed for. It had simple, but effective, sights, often painted with fluorescent material for use in low light. In the steady hand of a trained SOE operative, the Welrod could deliver a bullet to a precise spot, the back of the head, the heart, the neck. This was not a weapon for spraying and praying. It was a surgical instrument, designed for a single, fatal shot. This accuracy meant that the attacks were almost always instantly lethal, leaving no wounded soldiers to cry out and raise the alarm. There was just a sudden, silent death, and then an unnerving, absolute quiet. The combination of these three factors, the silence, the close-range lethality, and the accuracy, created a weapon that was perfectly suited for sudden, terrifying ambushes. A German patrol walking down a dark street would suddenly find their numbers reduced by 1 or 2, with no idea where the attack had come from. A high-ranking officer, sitting in what he believed was a secure office, would be found dead in his chair, with no sign of forced entry and no one having heard a thing. Fear of the Welrod began to spread like a virus through the German units stationed in occupied territories, particularly in France, Denmark, and the Netherlands where the SOE was most active. It was a fear born of the unknown. Soldiers are trained to fight an enemy they can see and hear. They are prepared for the roar of battle, the whistle of bullets, the explosion of grenades. They were not prepared for this. They were not prepared for a war fought with whispers and shadows. They began to call it the Flusterpistol, the whisper pistol. They spoke of British ghosts who could kill without a sound. The toy-like gun that had once been an object of ridicule was now a source of deep, psychological dread. It was a weapon that attacked not just the body, but the mind, turning every shadow into a potential threat, and every unexplained sound into a prelude to a silent, lonely death. The legend of the Welrod is not just in its design, but in the stories of the men who used it. These were not tales of grand battles, but of quiet, personal moments of extreme courage and terrifying intimacy. For the British commandos and SOE agents, the Welrod became a trusted, if unsettling, companion. One such story comes from a former SOE agent who operated in Denmark. His mission was to eliminate a Danish collaborator, a high-ranking official who was feeding information to the Gestapo, leading to the arrest and execution of dozens of resistance members. The collaborator lived in a heavily guarded apartment building in the center of Copenhagen. A frontal assault was impossible. The agent, a man in his early 20s named Peter, spent weeks studying the collaborator's routine. He learned that every Tuesday night, like clockwork, the man would walk his dog in a small, secluded park behind the apartment building. On a cold, moonless Tuesday night, Peter, dressed as a local workman, slipped into the park and hid in a thicket of bushes. He held the well rod, its cold, metallic form a stark contrast to the warmth of his own nervous hands. He could hear the collaborator approaching, whistling a cheerful tune, the dog's tags jingling in the quiet night. As the man passed his hiding spot, Peter stepped out. The collaborator turned, his eyes widening in surprise. He opened his mouth to shout, but it was too late. Peter didn't hesitate. He pressed the muzzle of the well rod against the man's thick overcoat, right over his heart, and pulled the trigger. The sound was so soft, a mere thump, that the dog barely even flinched. The collaborator collapsed without a sound, his whistle cut short. The dog, confused, began to lick its master's face, whining softly. Peter didn't wait. He simply melted back into the shadows, leaving the dog and its dead master in the silent park. The next morning, when the body was discovered, the German and Danish police were baffled. They found a small entry wound, but no bullet casing, and no witnesses who had heard a gunshot. It was another impossible, silent killing. For Peter, it was not a moment of triumph. He would later recall the haunting image of the dog, whining in confusion. The well rod, he said, made the act of killing feel too quiet, too personal. A second story, told by a British commando who took part in raids in Norway, illustrates the psychological impact of the well rod. His team was tasked with destroying a coastal radar station. To get to the station, they had to bypass a series of sentry posts. On the night of the raid, the commando, armed with a well rod, was responsible for clearing the first two posts. He and his partner crawled on their bellies through the snow for almost an hour to get within range of the first sentry post, which was manned by 2 German soldiers. The commando waited for a gust of wind to cover any sound. When the moment came, he aimed carefully at the first soldier and fired. The man dropped. His companion, who was looking in the other direction, didn't notice for a few crucial seconds. In that time, the commando manually reloaded the well rod, twist, pull, push, twist, and took aim again. He fired a second time. The second soldier fell. 2 men, dead, and the only sound was the howling of the wind. The commandos then proceeded to the main facility and completed their mission, destroying the radar station with explosives. Weeks later, during the interrogation of a German soldier who was captured in a different part of Norway, the story of the raid came up. The captured soldier, a young man who had been part of the garrison in that area, was visibly shaken when he spoke of it. He told the British intelligence officer that a survivor from the raided station had spread a terrifying story. The survivor claimed that the British commandos were not men, but night demons. He said they could kill with a touch, that they moved without making a sound, and that their weapons fired bolts of silence. The young German soldier said that after the raid, the morale in his unit had plummeted. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. The sentries were so terrified that they would fire their rifles at the slightest noise, a snapping twig, a gust of wind. The fear of the silent gun was, in many ways, more effective than the gun itself. One German survivor of a well rod attack, a corporal who was part of a patrol in a French village, gave a chilling account after the war. His patrol was walking down a narrow alley when the man in front of him, his best friend, suddenly stumbled and fell. The corporal thought he had tripped. He reached down to help him, and that's when he saw the blood pooling around his friend's head. There had been no sound, no warning. Panic erupted. The soldiers started shouting, aiming their rifles into the darkness, but there was nothing to shoot at. A moment later, another man from their patrol, at the back of the group, also fell, just as silently. The corporal said it was the most terrifying experience of his life. It was not war, he said, his voice still trembling with the memory years later. It was witchcraft. We were fighting ghosts. These stories, from both sides of the conflict, paint a vivid picture of the well rod's impact. It was a weapon that turned the rules of warfare upside down, replacing the noise and fury of battle with a cold, terrifying silence. Part 6, When Fear Took Over. The psychological impact of the Wellrod began to ripple through the German ranks in a way that no conventional weapon ever could. It wasn't about the number of casualties it caused. The Wellrod was a specialized tool, not a weapon of mass destruction. Its true power lay in the panic it created, the corrosive fear that it injected into the daily lives of the occupying forces. The fear was not of death itself, but of a specific kind of death, a silent, lonely, and seemingly inevitable one. This fear manifested in tangible ways. German patrols, which had once marched through the streets of occupied towns with an air of arrogant confidence, began to change their behavior. They started to avoid the narrow alleyways and the darkest streets, the very places where a silent attacker could be lurking. They began to walk in more scattered formations, hoping to make it harder for a single attacker to take out multiple soldiers. They started to shine their flashlights into every doorway, every shadow, their movements no longer confident, but jumpy and nervous. The hunters had begun to feel like the hunted. The warnings that were passed between German units became more and more frantic. Official reports started to mention attacks by an unknown silent weapon. But it was the unofficial warnings, the whispers between soldiers in the barracks and the mess halls, that truly spread the panic. They told stories of sentries who had vanished from their posts without a trace, only to be found hours later, dead, with a small, neat hole in them. They talked of officers who had been killed in their own beds, in locked rooms, with no sign of a break-in. The Wellrod became a ghost, a myth. The soldiers had given it their own name, the Geisterwaffe, the ghost weapon. They called it this because it seemed to defy the laws of physics. A weapon that could kill from the shadows without a sound, without a flash, was something out of a dark fairy tale. It played on the most primal human fears, the fear of the dark, the fear of the unknown, and the fear of an enemy you cannot see or hear. Imagine a young German soldier, perhaps no older than 18 or 19, on his first tour of duty in an occupied country. He has been trained to fight on a battlefield, to face tanks and artillery and enemy soldiers. But he is not on a battlefield. He is on a lonely street corner in a hostile town, surrounded by civilians who hate him. The sun has gone down, and the streets are dark and empty. Every closed window looks like a sniper's nest. Every dark alley seems to hold a silent assassin. He has heard the stories of the ghost weapon. He clutches his rifle, his knuckles white. A cat knocks over a trash can in a nearby alley, and he spins around, his heart pounding, his finger on the trigger. He is not just fighting the French resistance or the British commandos anymore. He is fighting his own imagination. He is fighting the fear that the Wellrod has planted in his mind. This psychological panic had a real, strategic impact. It degraded the morale and the effectiveness of the German troops. Sentries who were supposed to be watching for an invasion force were instead looking over their shoulders for a silent assassin. Officers who were supposed to be planning military operations were double-checking the locks on their doors and windows. The Wellrod had turned the mundane, daily routine of occupation into a high-stakes game of survival. This fear was not a side effect of the Wellrod's design, it was a central part of its purpose. The SOE knew that they could not defeat the German army with force of arms. But they could disrupt it. They could demoralize it. They could make the lives of the occupying soldiers a living hell. The Wellrod was a weapon of psychological warfare, a tool designed to create an atmosphere of constant, low-level terror. It was a testament to the ingenuity of its designers that this small, simple, toy-looking gun could achieve something that entire divisions of soldiers could not. It could strike fear into the very heart of the Nazi war machine, not with a bang, but with a whisper. When fear took over, the silent gun had already won a major victory without a single shot being fired. The Second World War was a crucible of technological innovation, a period where the desperate need for an advantage spurred the creation of incredible machines of destruction. We remember the iconic weapons of that era, the Spitfire, the Tiger tank, the atomic bomb. But in the shadows of these giants lies the legacy of a much smaller, quieter, and arguably more insidious weapon, the Wellrod pistol. Its legacy is not written in the histories of great battles, but in the evolution of covert warfare and the silent art of the kill. The Wellrod fundamentally changed the nature of close combat warfare. Before the Wellrod, a silenced weapon was typically a standard pistol with a cumbersome, often unreliable suppressor screwed onto the end of the barrel. The Wellrod was different. It was the first widely produced firearm to be designed from the ground up with an integrated suppressor. This holistic approach to design, where the silencer was not an accessory but an essential part of the weapon itself, was revolutionary. It created a level of sound suppression that was previously thought to be impossible. This concept, of a purpose-built, integrally suppressed firearm, would go on to influence generations of covert weapons, from the spy gadgets of the Cold War to the specialized tools used by modern special forces. The Welrod was more than just a piece of technology, it was a symbol of a new philosophy of warfare. It was the perfect weapon for the SOE and other resistance groups because it empowered the individual. It allowed a single, well-trained operative to have a strategic impact far beyond their numbers. It was a tool of asymmetric warfare, a way for the weak to fight the strong, not by meeting them on their own terms, but by striking at their vulnerabilities, at their sense of security, and at their morale. The Welrod proved that a war could be fought not just with armies, but with whispers and shadows. It cemented the role of special forces in covert operations as a critical component of modern military strategy. The use of the Welrod did not end with the defeat of Nazi Germany. Its simple, robust, and incredibly effective design meant that it remained in the secret arsenals of Britain and other nations for decades after the war. It saw service in the Korean War, in the Falklands, in Northern Ireland, and in numerous other covert conflicts around the globe. The toy-like gun that was rushed into production to fight the Nazis proved to be one of the most enduring and effective special operations weapons ever created. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Welrod is not in the technology it inspired or the conflicts it served in. It is in the stark and unsettling reminder it offers about the nature of war itself. War is not always about grand, heroic charges and the thunder of guns. It is also about the cold, quiet, and deeply personal act of killing. The Welrod, with its silent operation and its intimate, close-range use, stripped the act of killing of all its bombast and ceremony, reducing it to its terrifyingly simple essence. It was a weapon that forced its user to confront the grim reality of their work, a reality that was not glorious, but silent, lonely, and final. And so, we are left with the image of this strange, unassuming piece of metal, this bicycle pump that brought a unique and chilling fear to the most ruthless regime of the 20th century. It stands as a testament to the idea that in the great, dark theater of war, the most powerful and terrifying things do not always make the loudest noise. Sometimes, the most terrifying thing of all is the sound of silence. A silence that means an enemy is present, unheard, and unseen. A silence that was the calling card of the small, toy-looking British gun that, for a few terrifying years, became the ghost that haunted the Nazi war machine.